World War II. As the world struggled to recover from the ashes of World War I, ominous clouds of conflict began to gather once again. The Treaty of Versailles meant to bring lasting peace, sowed the seeds of future discord. In Germany, economic hardship and humiliation fueled resentment, paving the way for the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Amidst this backdrop, Europe became a powder keg of tension. Hitler's aggressive expansionist policies set the stage for the invasion of Poland, triggering the start of World War II. On September 1, 1939, the world held its breath as German forces unleashed Blitzkrieg, a lightning-fast assault that swept through Poland with unprecedented speed and ferocity. The invasion sent shockwaves across Europe as nations realized the dire threat posed by Hitler's regime. Britain and France, bound by treaties to defend Poland, declared war on Germany. Yet, the world stood on the brink of a conflict unlike any seen before, as Axis and allied powers prepared for a global conflagration. In the midst of uncertainty, individuals from all walks of life found themselves swept up in the maelstrom of war. Their stories, both ordinary and extraordinary, would come to define the chapters of history yet to unfold. The Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, unleashed by the German military, stunned the world with its speed and brutality. In the spring of 1940, Hitler's forces launched a series of lightning strikes against Denmark and Norway, swiftly overpowering both countries. These victories gave Germany strategic positions from which to launch further offensives. Next, the Blitzkrieg turned its gaze toward Western Europe. German forces stormed through the Low Countries, bypassing the heavily fortified Maginot Line, catching the Allies off guard. The Netherlands fell swiftly, followed by Belgium. The heart-stopping moment came with the invasion of France. German panzer divisions raced through the Ardennes forest, a route considered impassable by the Allies, flanking the heavily defended French border. The maneuver shocked French and British forces, leading to a chaotic retreat. As German troops advanced, panic gripped France. The French government evacuated to Bordeaux, while civilians fled in droves to escape the advancing enemy. Meanwhile, British expeditionary forces, along with French troops, found themselves pushed back to the coastal town of Dunkirk. The evacuation of Dunkirk stands as a testament to courage and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. Operation Dynamo, a massive rescue effort, saw hundreds of civilian boats joining military vessels to evacuate Allied soldiers from the beaches. Though harried by German air attacks, over 300,000 troops were safely evacuated, providing a glimmer of hope in the face of imminent defeat. The fall of France sent shockwaves across the world. With France out of the war and Britain standing alone against the might of Nazi Germany, the stage was set for one of the most critical moments in history, the Battle of Britain. As the dark clouds of war gathered over Europe, the evacuation of Dunkirk emerged as a defining moment of resilience amidst despair. In late May 1940, with the German army advancing rapidly and Allied forces trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, it seemed as though all hope was lost. However, in the face of adversity, a remarkable rescue operation was launched. Operation Dynamo, as it was named, became one of the largest maritime evacuations in history. British naval vessels, supported by a flotilla of civilian boats, raced across the English Channel under constant threat of Luftwaffe attacks to rescue stranded soldiers. From May 26 to June 4, 1940, a relentless stream of ships shuttled back and forth, evacuating soldiers under heavy bombardment. Despite being exposed to strafing runs and bombing raids, the spirit of solidarity among the rescuers prevailed. Civilians from all walks of life joined the effort, risking their lives to bring their trapped compatriots home. Fishing boats, pleasure crafts, and merchant marine vessels braved the treacherous waters, earning Dunkirk the moniker, the miracle of deliverance. By the end of the evacuation, over 330,000 Allied soldiers had been rescued, far exceeding initial expectations. While much of the heavy equipment had to be abandoned, the evacuation of soldiers was a strategic success that bolstered morale and ensured that Britain could continue the fight against Nazi Germany. The Dunkirk evacuation, though born from the depths of defeat, became a symbol of hope and determination, laying the groundwork for the resilience that would characterize the Allied effort throughout the war. With the evacuation of Dunkirk complete, Britain stood alone against the might of Nazi Germany. The Battle of Britain, waged in the skies over England from July to October 1940, would test the courage and resilience of the British people like never before. Hitler's plan for invading Britain, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, hinged upon achieving air superiority. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, launched relentless bombing raids targeting British airfields, radar stations, cities, and industrial centres in what became known as the Blitz. In response, the Royal Air Force RAF rose to the challenge. Outnumbered and outgunned, British pilots, famously dubbed the Few by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, valiantly defended their skies against overwhelming odds. The battle raged fiercely in the air, with dogfights becoming a daily occurrence over the English Channel and southern England. The Spitfire and the Hurricane, iconic British fighter planes, became symbols of resistance as they faced off against the Luftwaffe's Messerschmitts and bombers. Despite heavy losses on both sides, the RAF's tenacity and the effectiveness of Britain's air defence system, including the revolutionary chain home radar network, proved decisive. The Luftwaffe, unable to establish air superiority, shifted its focus from targeting airfields to bombing civilian populations. The Blitz, while devastating, failed to break British morale. Instead, it strengthened the resolve of the British people to resist Nazi aggression. The Battle of Britain marked a turning point in the war, as Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely, acknowledging the resilience of the British RAF and population. By the end of October 1940, the RAF had successfully defended British airspace, dealing a significant blow to Hitler's plans for invasion and inspiring hope only in Britain, but across the free world. The courage and sacrifice of the few became a symbol of British defiance in the face of tyranny. While the Battle of Britain raged in the West, Hitler's ambitions turned eastward. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, marked the beginning of the largest military operation in history and a turning point in World War II. Breaking the Non-Aggression Pact with the Soviet Union, German forces poured across the vast plains of Eastern Europe and a blitzkrieg assault aimed at capturing Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev. The initial advance was swift and seemed unstoppable as Soviet forces were caught off guard. The brutality of the Eastern Front soon became apparent as German troops, driven by Nazi ideology, unleashed a campaign of terror and destruction. Massacres of Jews and other civilians, scorched earth tactics, and intense fighting characterized a brutal struggle on the Eastern Front. Despite early successes, the harsh Russian winter and the resilience of the Soviet people began to take its toll on the German invaders. The siege of Leningrad, enduring for over 800 days, became a symbol of Soviet resistance, while the Battle of Stalingrad would later turn the tide of the entire war. Operation Barbarossa would ultimately fail in its objective to defeat the Soviet Union swiftly. The Soviet Red Army, bolstered by reinforcements and aided by harsh weather conditions, launched a counteroffensive that pushed the Germans back. The Eastern Front would become a cauldron of death and destruction, claiming millions of lives on both sides. It would also become the stage for some of the war's most brutal battles and heroic acts of resistance, shaping the course of World War II and the fate of Europe. As Europe was engulfed in war, the United States remained neutral, but its stance was soon to change dramatically. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise military strike at the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, thrusting the United States into World War II. Early on that Sunday morning, Japanese aircraft launched from aircraft carriers unleashed a devastating assault on the Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor. In a matter of hours, battleships were sunk or heavily damaged, aircraft destroyed, and thousands of servicemen killed or wounded. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a strategic move by Japan to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet and remove American interference in the Pacific theater, particularly in Southeast Asia. However, it had the opposite effect, galvanizing American resolve and uniting the nation behind the war effort. President Franklin D. Roosevelt famously described December 7, 1941, as a date which will live in infamy, and called for Congress to declare war on Japan, which they did the following day. The attack on Pearl Harbor propelled the United States into a global conflict on two fronts, in Europe and the Pacific. It marked the beginning of America's full-scale involvement in World War II and ignited a spirit of determination to avenge the losses suffered that day. The events of Pearl Harbor would shape the course of the war in the Pacific and ultimately lead to Japan's defeat, but not without tremendous sacrifice and hardship on both sides. Following the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, the Pacific theater of war became a battleground of island-hopping campaigns, where each island seized became a stepping stone towards Japan. The strategy of island hopping, devised by Allied commanders, aimed to bypass heavily fortified Japanese strongholds while establishing strategic bases closer to the Japanese mainland. This strategy allowed Allied forces to gradually advance towards Japan while avoiding direct confrontations wherever possible. The Pacific campaign was grueling and marked by fierce jungle warfare, amphibious assaults, and naval battles. Islands like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa became synonymous with some of the bloodiest battles of the war. At Guadalcanal, the first major offensive of the Pacific War, American and Japanese forces clashed in a brutal 6-month-long campaign for control of the island. The Battle of Midway, a pivotal naval battle, halted Japanese expansion and turned the tide of the war in the Pacific in favor of the Allies. Each island captured came at a high cost in terms of lives lost, but it brought the Allies closer to Japan. The strategy of island hopping proved successful, albeit at great sacrifice, as it set the stage for the eventual defeat of Japan and the end of World War II in the Pacific. The Pacific Front struggles showcased the bravery and determination of Allied forces in some of the most challenging conditions of the war, laying the groundwork for the final push towards victory. In the heart of the Eastern Front, the city of Stalingrad would become the crucible where the fate of Nazi Germany was sealed. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought from August 1942 to February 1943, stands as one of the deadliest battles in human history and a turning point in World War II. Hitler's decision to capture Stalingrad, a key industrial center on the Volga River, and a symbolic prize named after Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, led to a brutal showdown between German and Soviet forces. The battle devolved into intense street-to-street combat and savage close-quarters fighting. The city became a hellish landscape of bombed-out buildings, rubble-strewn streets, and constant artillery barrages. Both sides suffered staggering casualties as the brutal winter added another layer of misery to the already horrific conditions. The Soviet Red Army, under the leadership of General Zhukov, launched a massive counteroffensive encircling the German Sixth Army inside the city. The encirclement of the German forces at Stalingrad marked a significant turning point in the war. Despite Hitler's orders to fight to the last man, the German army was forced to surrender in February 1943, dealing a severe blow to Nazi morale and signaling the beginning of the end for Hitler's ambitions in the East. The Battle of Stalingrad not only halted the German advance into the Soviet Union, but also shifted the momentum of the entire war in favor of the Allies. It showed that the seemingly invincible German war machine could be defeated and paved the way for the eventual liberation of Europe. As the Allies fought tooth and nail on multiple fronts, preparations were underway for the most audacious invasion in history, D-Day. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces launched Operation Overlord. the long-awaited invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, landing on the beaches of Normandy in France. The invasion involved thousands of ships, aircraft, and troops from the United States, Great Britain, Canada, and other allied nations. The beaches of Normandy were divided into 5 sectors: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, each assigned to different allied forces. In the pre-dawn hours of June 6th, under the cover of darkness and a massive naval bombardment, allied paratroopers were dropped behind enemy lines to disrupt German defenses. As dawn broke, the invasion fleet approached the coast, braving fierce German resistance. The landings were met with heavy machine gun fire, artillery barrages, and obstacles laid out by the Germans. Omaha Beach, in particular, became a scene of carnage as American forces struggled to establish a foothold under withering fire. Despite the initial chaos and high casualties, Allied troops persevered. Through sheer determination and courage, they fought their way off the beaches and began to establish beachheads. By the end of the day, the Allies had secured a tenuous foothold in Normandy, but at a tremendous cost. D-Day marked the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi tyranny. It was a pivotal moment that turned the tide of the war in favor of the Allies and set the stage for the eventual defeat of Hitler's Germany. The sacrifices made on the beaches of Normandy ensured that freedom would prevail. As the Allies pushed deeper into German-occupied territory after D-Day, they faced one final major German offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, Hitler launched a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest in Belgium, aiming to split the Allied lines and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. The German offensive caught the Allies off guard, as bad weather hampered air support and intelligence failed to predict the scale of the attack. German forces, including many elite units, spearheaded their assaults through thinly defended sectors, creating a bulge in the Allied lines, hence the name Battle of the Bulge. The Ardennes offensive unleashed some of the fiercest fighting of the war in the bitter cold of winter. American troops, outnumbered and facing harsh conditions, fought valiantly to hold the line against the German onslaught. Despite initial gains by the Germans, Allied resistance stiffened, and reinforcements were rushed to the front lines. The Siege of Bastogne, where American paratroopers defiantly held the town against overwhelming odds, became a symbol of Allied determination. As the weather cleared, Allied air power was unleashed, disrupting German supply lines and providing much-needed support to the embattled ground forces. The German advance began to falter, and by January 1945, the Allies had regained lost ground and pushed the Germans back. The Battle of the Bulge was the last major German offensive on the Western Front and exacted a heavy toll on both sides. While it delayed the Allied advance, it also depleted Germany's dwindling reserves and hastened the end of the war in Europe. As 1945 dawned, the Allies pressed their advantage on all fronts, closing in on Nazi Germany from east and west. The Soviet Red Army, after the victories at Stalingrad and Kursk, launched a massive offensive that would culminate in the fall of Berlin. In April 1945, Soviet forces began their final assault on Berlin, the heart of the Third Reich. The Battle of Berlin was a brutal and apocalyptic struggle as Soviet troops fought their way through the devastated streets against fanatical resistance from German forces. Street by street, building by building, the Red Army advanced, facing fierce opposition and heavy casualties. The city was subjected to relentless artillery bombardment and aerial bombing, reducing much of it to rubble. Amidst the chaos, Adolf Hitler, holed up in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, refused to surrender, instead choosing to cling to the last vestiges of his crumbling regime. As Soviet forces closed in, Hitler committed suicide on April 30, 1945, marking the end of an era of terror. On May 2, 1945, Berlin surrendered, but the fighting across Germany continued as pockets of resistance held out. With the fall of Berlin, the end of the war in Europe was imminent. The fall of Berlin symbolized the defeat of Nazi Germany and the endgame of World War II in Europe. It came at a tremendous cost in lives and devastation, but it also heralded the liberation of millions from tyranny and the dawn of a new era. As the war in Europe drew to a close, the conflict in the Pacific still raged on. In a bid to bring about a swift end to the war with Japan, the United States made a decision that would change the course of history: the use of atomic bombs. On August 6, 1945, the world witnessed the devastating power of nuclear weapons as the United States dropped an atomic bomb, codenamed Little Boy, on the city of Hiroshima. The explosion instantly obliterated much of the city and caused widespread death and destruction. The aftermath of the Hiroshima bombing was catastrophic, with tens of thousands killed instantly and many more dying in the days, weeks, and years that followed due to radiation sickness and injuries. Entire neighborhoods were leveled, leaving behind only charred rubble and shadows etched into stone. Despite the horror of Hiroshima, Japan did not immediately surrender. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, a second atomic bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, further devastating the city and its inhabitants. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain the only use of nuclear weapons in warfare to this day. The decision to use atomic bombs remains one of the most controversial in history, with debates continuing over its necessity and moral implications. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its surrender, bringing an end to World War II. The dawn of the atomic age brought with it a new era of warfare and a heightened awareness of the destructive power humanity now possessed. With Japan's surrender, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief as the deadliest conflict in human history came to an end. The aftermath of World War II was a period of liberation, rebuilding, and remembrance. Across Europe, Allied forces liberated concentration camps, revealing the full horror of the Holocaust and the extent of Nazi atrocities. The liberation brought both liberation and heartbreak as survivors emerged from the shadows of oppression, but also as millions mourned the loss of loved ones. In the Pacific, Allied forces began the task of occupying Japan and overseeing its reconstruction. The devastation caused by the war left scars that would take decades to heal, but it also paved the way for Japan's transformation into a peaceful and democratic nation. The end of World War II brought about a new world order, with the establishment of the United Nations aimed at preventing future conflicts and promoting international cooperation. Yet, the war's legacy continued to reverberate for generations to come. Remembrance became an integral part of post-war societies, with memorials, museums, and commemorations honoring the sacrifices made by millions. Veterans returned home to rebuild their lives, and the world vowed to never forget the lessons learned from the horrors of war. As the world looked towards the future, the memories of World War II served as a reminder of the cost of conflict and the importance of working towards peace and reconciliation. The echoes of valor from those who fought and suffered during the war would resonate for years to come. Despite the end of World War II, tensions between the former allies, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, soon gave rise to a new era of geopolitical rivalry, the Cold War. The Cold War, a state of political and military tension, emerged from ideological differences, competing spheres of influence, and fears of nuclear conflict. The world became divided into two blocks: the Western Bloc led by the United States and the Eastern Bloc led by the Soviet Union. The end of World War II saw Europe divided, with the Soviet Union establishing communist governments in Eastern European countries. The United States, fearing the spread of communism, implemented policies such as the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe and contain Soviet influence. Tensions escalated with the establishment of NATO North Atlantic Treaty Organization by Western powers and the formation of the Warsaw Pact by the Eastern Bloc. The arms race intensified, with both sides developing nuclear weapons and engaging in proxy wars and espionage. The Cold War also played out in conflicts such as the Korean War and the Vietnam War, where the United States and the Soviet Union backed opposing sides in a struggle for influence. The world lived under the shadow of nuclear annihilation as both superpowers maintained massive arsenals of nuclear weapons, leading to periods of heightened tension such as the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cold War would shape global politics for decades to come, influencing alliances, conflicts, and the course of history. It was a time of fear, suspicion, but also technological advancement and ideological struggle that defined much of the 20th century. As time passed since the end of World War II, its legacy continued to echo through generations, leaving behind profound lessons for humanity. Courage in the face of adversity became a hallmark of those who lived through the war. Ordinary men and women displayed extraordinary bravery, whether they were soldiers storming the beaches of Normandy or civilians enduring the horrors of occupation and persecution. The war also highlighted the importance of unity and cooperation among nations. The Allied victory was only possible through the combined efforts of nations, putting aside their differences to confront a common enemy. This spirit of cooperation led to the establishment of international organizations like the United Nations, aimed at preventing future conflicts. World War II also served as a stark reminder of the consequences of intolerance, hatred, and extremism. The Holocaust stands as a testament to the depths of human cruelty, emphasizing the need to stand against bigotry and injustice wherever it arises. The post-war era saw efforts to rebuild and reconcile. Nations devastated by war worked to rebuild their societies and economies, while efforts were made to seek justice for war crimes and atrocities. Perhaps most importantly, World War II taught the world the true cost of war. The immense loss of life, the destruction of cities, and the suffering endured by millions served as a sobering reminder of the need to strive for peace and diplomacy wherever possible. As we look back on the legacy of World War II, we honor the sacrifices made and the courage shown by so many. It is a reminder that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can endure, and from the ashes of war, we can build a better future. Thanks for watching.